All right. Hi, everyone. Today, we are very excited to have Sid Banerjee as our speaker. Sid is an associate professor in the School of Operations at Cornell, where he works on topics at the intersection of data-driven decision-making, network algorithms, and market design. Sid got his PhD from the ECE department at UT Austin, and he was a postdoctoral researcher in the social algorithms lab at Stanford. He was also a technical consultant with the research science group at Lyft from 2014 to 2018. And today, Sid is going to tell us about reasoning about fairness in online allocation. Sid, you can take it away.
Awesome, thank you. Just to make sure everyone can see this. Okay, actually I can see this, good. Um, all right, so thanks a lot for the invitation. Uh, this is actually super exciting for me. So, I mean, I've been thinking on and off about sort of fairness in the context of online allocation, but most of the work I do is in thinking about online allocation, online decision making of various forms. And we've been thinking about these questions related to fairness, but I haven't really talked to too many people who only think about fairness. So I'm be really excited to get feedback on it. Please feel free to sort of let loose anytime. Any comments, criticisms, concerns would be super useful. And I can see everyone and also see the chat. So feel free to just raise your hands or yeah, shout out anytime, ask a question. I can pause. Um, okay, so what's this talk about? Let me just sort of immediately get into the simple model that I'll be studying before I get into the fairness question. So the model that I'm going to study is that of repeated online allocation. And here's kind of a toy version of it. So I have these two agents. Each day there's some resource which shows up and I have one unit of that resource and these two agents are competing for it. So what I've shown here is I have these two agents and these are their values that they have. So this is agent one who has some value one, agent two has value two on this day, and you have one unit of the resource. Um, and I'll assume that the resource for simplicity is divisible. So what I can do is I can take this resource, split it up between these two agents. And once I do that, they are going to get the value times the fraction of the resource that they got. So it's one of the simplest sort of online allocation settings we can think of. So next day, again, the agents have new values, a new resource shows up. I again decide how to allocate this. This keeps going on. Sorry, 1 second. And then after some period of time, so after some horizon capital T, what I want to think about is what is the utility each agent has. So in this case, the utility of an agent A is going to be sum overall days of the value that they had for the resource on that day times the allocation that they got. And I have a simple budget constraint that each day the amount of allocation I give is at most one. Okay, so this is going to be the setting that I'm going to use for the entire talk. Now, I haven't said where the values come from, what assumptions I have, and we'll go into that later in the talk. But um, this is kind of the primitive that we are using throughout. So any questions? Okay. Um, so of course, when I talk about agent utility, there's a kind of natural follow-up, like what do I want to do with these utilities? So what's the objective that I want to think about? And instead of like talking about the objectives, let me actually give some scenarios and then let's think a bit about, okay, what could the objective be? So suppose this was a parking spot. Um, you're a city or maybe you're a, like, yeah, so you're a city, you have these parking spots, you have these commuters coming in, you can put prices on these parking spots to decide who gets these spots. So in this case, it's not a divisible resource, but maybe you can think of some fractional version of this. But in any case, it's not too controversial to say that maybe what you want to do in this case is maximize revenue. So you want to put some prices on these spots and then try to maximize what revenue you get from these. Okay, so now we are getting closer to things I want to think about. So what if these what if the resources are conference rooms? So I have a set of conference rooms. Each day I decide who gets to use these conference rooms. This is in, as Aaron said, the before times when we were using conference rooms for talks, who gets to use these. And there's a sense in which, okay, faculty and students all have a certain right to use these conference rooms, but clearly everyone can't use them all the time. But nevertheless, maybe we can still think about maximizing some notion of welfare in this case. So maybe we take a utilitarian view and say we want to just add up everyone's utilities and try to maximize that in our allocations. But it's not totally clear how we would coordinate the agents in this case. In particular, we don't really want to charge faculty money for reserving conference rooms, or faculty or students, but how exactly do we coordinate them if we insisted on trying to maximize welfare? Um, the problem I really want to think about is this one. So each day, my resource is now some donation of food that I got, and it's kind of, for simplicity, think of this food as being it's perishable, so I need to give it out by the end of this day. I have a bunch of different food banks, so I'm sort of the central coordinating food bank. I have a different food distribution sites which want this amount of food, and I need to decide who gets how much. Uh, and in this case, at least for me, it wasn't clear what is the objective that I want to do. Like, does it make sense to talk about welfare? I clearly don't want to talk about revenue because I'm sort of a nonprofit trying to give out this food. So, what exactly am I trying to maximize in a setting like this? Okay, so why do I want to think about this? So this is actually a problem I've been working on for a while now. There's these things called the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the second one is that we should be ending hunger. Maybe our priorities have changed a little bit, but in some sense, it's hard to argue about this as the right priority for most things. Like I'd have I'm okay if people have issues with things like maximizing revenue and or welfare, but hunger seems kind of easy to argue about, or that we shouldn't want this. And in particular, the reason I started thinking about this problem was I kind of heard this amazing podcast about how Feeding America works, and this was I think back in 2015. So this was a podcast about how these group of economists, in particular Camus Prendergast, sort of went in and reformulated the way Feeding America were sort of handing out resources. So I know by now Feeding America has got much more popular, but just in case people don't really know what this is, so Feeding America is a nonprofit clearinghouse which essentially gets food donations from like large institutional donors. So think of things like Nestle or like big sort of food processing companies. They or even like big farms. They get the food and then they try to match it up with all the food banks across the country. So you get these shipments of food, and then you need to decide where should I send these shipments of food. And they were traditionally sort of taking all of this and writing a big optimization problem to solve it. And of course, the optimization was way too large. And there are these stories of every food bank in Idaho getting all shipments of potatoes because, local optimal solutions, why not? Um, and what these people did, what like Pendergrass and group did, was they went into Feeding America and said, well, maybe what you should do is instead of trying to solve these optimization problems to impose what you want in the system, maybe you should set up a marketplace. And they were like, well, hold on 1 second. We don't want to raise money. And said, no, you just set up a marketplace which does not use money, but uses some kind of proxy for money and then see how it does. Um, so I found this pretty amazing because, okay, this is like I think about online allocation and I think about marketplaces, but this was this sort of weird world where it was online allocation and it was a marketplace, but it was it was none of these in a certain sense. Like it was something completely different. And so we've been like thinking a lot about this since then. And in particular, a bunch of us have been working for like the last few years with our local food bank. So it's what's called the Food Bank of the Southern Tier. So I'm in upstate New York, and in 2017, they were the Food Bank of the Year. I had nothing to do with that. Actually, I started working with them afterwards, and they've since gone downhill, I guess. But no, they're still an amazing food bank, and like we've been sort of trying to talk to them on and off, thinking about various problems they have and see various ways to help out, and that really kind of motivates all the things that I'm going to talk about today. So, so with that sort of aside as to why I'm interested in this, let's get back to thinking about fairness. And I'm going to think about fairness in a setting where I think it's somewhat better understood, which is, well, what if instead of doing these allocations over time, I was just doing it in one shot? So what if I knew all the valuations up front um, and I needed to decide who gets how much of these allocations? So I have a bunch of agents. Agents tell me exactly what their valuations are. Um, you should definitely feel uncomfortable about this. Like, do agents really give these numbers? Let's keep that aside for a moment. But agents tell me these numbers, and I now need to choose an allocation, and then each agent gets this utility, and I still have these budget constraints, and I know all the information up front. Um, so I claim in a setting like this, there are actually many different ways of thinking about fairness, and I'm sure that most of you have thought about fairness in these settings in various different ways. But at a high level, I tend to categorize these ways of thinking about it in three distinct sort of like underlying threads of thought. So uh, three underlying viewpoints. So one of them is what I think of as an algorithmic viewpoint, which is, well, this is an optimization problem. Let's just pick some objective which we think represents some notion of fairness. So for example, if we can pick max min to be an objective because that seems like it's equalizing everyone in a certain sense. You may have issues with max min. Okay, I have issues with max min in various contexts. And I think in many of these contexts, there's a much better argument for using something like the geometric mean of everyone's utilities, which is something called the Nash social welfare. But at the end of the day, really all I'm doing is I'm taking this problem and I'm imposing some optimization, like some objective on top of it, which I hope encodes some notion of fairness.
Sid,
So
can I
that,
ask a
yeah,
question that
yeah,
might
go
be
for it.
premature in that maybe you're going to answer it, but it would help me in thinking about these different objectives. So, like when I think about like fairness objectives and like fair division, I sort of think about, okay, like the entities that we are sort of dividing the goods amongst are the ones we want to be fair to, like the people. And
Yeah.
if anticipating that you're going to say the entities here are like the food banks, it's going to be less obvious to me that I want to be fair like to the food banks themselves. Like somehow my fairness concern is going to be for the like hungry people who are fed at the food banks, and I don't care so much like
What the food
which
banks.
food bank they're fed at. I care about properties of the sort of people.
Yeah, no, I actually completely agree with you. I will impose, I do think the fundamental unit is people in this case. So when I do talk about the food banks, it will be fairness at the level of people coming to the food bank. Now, one reason why people don't do that sometimes is in other settings, there's a worry that maybe the firm does not correctly report how many agents are coming. And one amazing thing with working with food banks is you just, to an extent, you really don't need to worry about these kind of strategic issues. Like the food banks really want to try and coordinate things well amongst themselves. That there is no, they're not trying to gamify the system. So it's super nice to be able to think of these without worrying about the strategic aspect. And I say this, and in a little while I'm going to start talking about the strategic aspects. But like increasingly, the work we've been doing has been going away from the strategic aspects and just like assuming we know what how many people are showing up, but we still need to. So we don't need to deal with incentives, but we need to deal with uncertainty. Like uncertainty is the, we don't know exactly how many people will come in. Nobody is sort of, people are not RSVPing to say they're coming to pick up food, and
Okay,
that's the challenge.
cool.
But
And so just to sort of get myself in the right frame of mind as I read the bullet points that are about to pop up here, should I think of the utility functions that you're talking about here when we talk about max min or Nash social welfare as being utility functions for people rather than for the food banks?
no, that's a fair question. The utility functions are for the people. They will, yeah. So each agent here is a person who's coming in and with a certain value. Um, I'll talk about slightly more general settings later, but yeah, the utility is always for the person, but it is still unclear what maximizing this objective over all the people is, like how people are thinking about it. So that's why I'm sort of saying this is an algorithmic viewpoint of fairness, which it's kind of imposed on high. Here's an objective. It's not yet obvious what it says about how people think about it. Um,
Got it.
so I'm going to sort of contrast this to what I think of as the economic viewpoint, which is that, well, if I want to be fair across all these people, an alternate way of doing it is let me not try and decide this upfront, but let me sort of give everyone a budget and then just tell them, okay, why don't you all decide how you want to spend the budget to allocate? So essentially in this simple setting, I'm basically saying set up a share market, if and let these agents decide amongst themselves and figure out who should get what. And given that everyone has an equal budget, that intuitively seems like a fair way to do this allocation. So that's viewpoint 2 about how people think about fairness in these settings. Viewpoint 3, and this is sort of closer to, I guess, what Aaron was asking, is let's actually think about this from the point of view of the agent. And so in particular, let me put axiomatic desiderata on what I want an allocation to look like. And two natural things to ask for are, well, I would like the allocation to be Pareto efficient. There shouldn't be a way of making someone happier while everyone else's utility remains the same. But it would also be nice if it's MV free. So if every agent weekly prefers what they get compared to what anyone else gets. So as an aside, I've given this talk usually to people who don't think about fairness, because I'm guessing many of you kind of see the punchline that is coming up in the next slide. But for those of y'all who don't, there's a reason why I sort of set it up this way, where I put up these three viewpoints. So optimization using Nash social welfare, economics using the Fisher market, axiomatic using Pareto efficient and NB free. Because one sort of really nice thing about these three different ways of looking at it is in a very large class of settings, they're actually equivalent. And this, at least I first read it in this sort of work of Alvarians back in 74, where he essentially said, paraphrasing a bit and kind of hiding some assumptions, as long as the items are divisible, and if you have linear utilities or if you have any sort of strictly increasing concave utilities, there's actually a unique allocation which satisfies all these three viewpoints. So it has to be Nash social welfare maximizing. You can't swap in any other optimization problem. It has to be the Fisher market, and it has to be this exact combination of axioms. But if you are comfortable with any of these, then this is your answer. And for me, this is nice because, well, it at least means, well, this seems like a natural touch point in some sense to think about fairness in these allocation settings. I'm not saying this is the only answer. Like clearly there are many things missing. So even the fact that I'm assuming valuations is problematic, etc., etc. But it is still a very nice sort of point at which we can start off thinking about these problems.
Questions? Let me ask one question here also, because this is cool. But I guess like if you had, instead of saying Fisher market equilibrium, you had said sort of like the Walrasian equilibrium in a regular old exchange economy with quasi-linear utilities, then you'd have like the same thing, but like instead of Nash social welfare, it would be regular social welfare.
Yeah, exactly.
And so like, why is this slide more convincing that Nash social welfare is the thing to think about compared to like this hypothetical other slide I could have written down that would like convince me that I should just care about regular social welfare?
Yeah, okay. It's a great question. This is where my ideal answer would be to say, well, I'm going to put on my engineering hat. Someone's asked me to do this, so why not? But no, but I think that's a really fair question. So a partial answer would be the third bullet point, the fact that it has this axiomatic interpretation in terms of Pareto efficiency and NB freeness. Another answer which usually people give when thinking about Nash social welfare, and this is going to show up later in my talk, is I keep harping on this fact that people have valuations, but this is very problematic for one silly reason, which is like, okay, how do I know what people's units are? So I am thinking of my valuations in the Zimbabwean dollar or some sort of currency which is highly like has huge amount of inflation. So if I say it's worth $1 million to me and $1 to you, maybe it's the same thing. There's a sort of problem of, it's not obvious how we do interpersonal comparisons when we have Nash social welfare, when we do social welfare instead of Nash social welfare. The usual answer to that is, well, you do interpersonal comparisons by having this extra resource called money. But what I'm going to try and argue in the rest of this talk is, yeah, I don't want to think about money. So that would be a slightly longer answer to why these three make sense to me. Is that? I was tempted to say, is that fair? But okay, sorry. Why not? Is that fair?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So yeah, I really like this result. So even though I know this is somewhat bringing coals to Newcastle, I still feel like it's worth sort of emphasizing this to the extent that I also found a picture of Halvarian looking very happy with this result. I'd be pretty happy if I figured this out. This is his original paper where he found this. If anyone hasn't read it, this is really fun to read. It's a fun kind of cornerstone in this literature. Okay, so that's Halvarian. What do I want to do? Well, I want to do online allocation. And so I want to somehow think about how do these viewpoints coalesce when I start trying to give these items online. So in particular, okay, what if I take the algorithmic viewpoint? Maybe I have some objective which I'm happy to think of as being fair. And so maybe I want to maximize something like the social welfare. And the natural kind of question, if we put on our TCS hat, would be, well, let's assume these values are arbitrary, and let's think about something like how well can we do in terms of like competitive ratios. So how well can we maximize the social welfare if I don't know these values up front. And kind of spoiler alert, what I'll talk a little bit about is, in general, you can't do it very well, but it turns out that if you have some predictive ability, so if you can say something about these agents, you can get surprisingly sharp, like surprisingly good competitive ratios, much sharper than what you can without these predictions. So there's a sharp sort of transition as soon as you have some predictive ability about these agents. So that's kind of the algorithmic vignette that I want to say. We've also been looking a lot at this from this more economic viewpoint of like what happens if, like, can we analyze this marketplace that Pendergrass et al. Was setting up, where you just give everyone artificial credits and then run some kind of mechanism each day. So for example, maybe you just run a first price auction each day and you accept payment in these artificial credits. But of course, these credits they have no intrinsic value in themselves. So like formally, the utility here is no longer quasi-linear. You're just using the credits as a means of being able to get something, but they have no value outside. You can't take these fake credits to a shop and buy things. But it still turns out that given enough time, so if you have these credits available for a long enough period of time, you have extremely strong sort of near equilibrium properties, but also really surprising worst case guarantees for these settings. So that's what I want to sort of spend the rest of this talk talking about. But I actually feel neither of these were particularly satisfying answers, at least when thinking about the local food bank. So like this was actually a problem we were doing with the local food bank. They have this food pantry which goes out each day. It's a truck where they load it up with food, go out each day and give food to various people. And in some sense, getting back to what Aaron was saying, the real problem there is not things like strategic behavior. It's not things like these values are uncertain in some min-max sense, but it's just that there is uncertainty. Like when you hit the ground, what really turns out to matter is how do you deal with the uncertainty? Like how do you deal with not knowing how many people are actually going to show up to get food, and like what are good policies for that? And there it turns out taking, like you really need to deal with the uncertainty head on. And like what we were able to do is kind of take more of an information theoretic view and like characterize like a fundamental trade-off between like, sort of how the uncertainty hurts you in terms of MV and efficiency in these settings. So not gonna talk about that today, but again, like my colleague Christina Yu is an information theorist, and like this is really much more her work than mine, but I'm happy to sort of discuss this offline. So that's kind of the overall story of what we've been doing. We've been kind of taking variance result and then spinning it off in various ways to think about these online settings. So I'm going to jump straight in, or like any questions. If not, I'll jump straight in, and I'll start off with actually the second part of the story, which is what happens when you set up these artificial credit markets. And this was a series of work which I did with my ex-student Arthur Gorok and also my colleague Chris Iyer, who's now at Minnesota. Sorry, was there a question? Or... No, okay. So, and the reason we were thinking about this problem, as I mentioned, was because of what Feeding America did. So this is kind of what the Feeding America auction looks in the background. So what happens is each of these food banks get these points. So this is, they get some amount of points, and then, so this is the Los Angeles Food Bank. They have these 9,500 points with which they can bid. These points are decided, I think at the beginning of the year, there's some process of trying to decide who gets how much based on like past data. But once you have these, then they are basically going in every day and participating in these auctions. So here we have a box of cereal, or like 100,000 boxes of cereals, and LA is bidding some number of points for these.
Sorry, I've got a quick question just out
Yeah,
of
sure.
curiosity, because this seems really cool. Is there some contingency for the event that like whoever's in charge of like the Los Angeles Food Bank is very bad at budgeting and they run out of these points like before the end of the year and then they just can't buy any more food?
Yeah, not really. And yeah, so they are, so there's a partial contingency in that, okay, all food banks usually have a local inventory. So they have like these big storage facilities. So they don't really run out of food. They also get local food donations. And there is a way in which you can take the donations you get and put them on the market to get back points. So it really is much more of like an exchange economy in that sense rather than a fisher market. But those are still second order, I think. Okay, I'm not an expert on this. You should definitely get Canis Prendergast at some point to give a talk. But he's really amazing. But even though these were big, these were second order effects. So they're really hoping the food bank people are good. But on the other hand, food banks are amazing in that the people working are volunteers, but they really are good at what they do. They think a lot about it. They know what they want. They're good at strategizing about this stuff. So
Can I ask something about the
yeah, go ahead.
in this marketplace, is there sort of like a, I divide by 100 and this reflects dollar values, or I divide by 1,000 and this reflects dollar values of these goods?
That's a good question. So you're really asking how is, like, for example, the base price chosen? As far as I know, okay, I don't know is the correct answer, but yeah, no, that's a fair question. Like, in principle, these numbers, there's no divisor, right? Like, there's no intrinsic value, so um, it's not obvious what the unit is at all, and I don't know how they actually set it up front.
I'm curious about the prices at which the marketplace settles.
Right.
I could very well imagine that they settle to be some multiple of the supermarket price for these goods, but I'm just curious if that happens.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that is a really good question. Like, yeah, okay. I don't have a good idea. Like,
Yeah.
but okay. But yeah, so this is the market we wanted to study. And kind of okay, if you want a little more application or like more motivation, this is actually being used in many other settings. So people have been thinking about using things like this. So CEI, this competitive equilibrium from equal incomes in a wide variety of other settings. So and moreover, like the technology is becoming easier to set up these markets. So people are sort of increasingly trying to do this. But I don't think we completely understand what these outcomes are yet in general. So that's what we wanted to think about. And what we wanted to think about was this really simple version of the setting, which is, well, we are setting up a repeated allocation mechanism where we're giving everyone some artificial credits. And then we're setting up some mechanism each day. And we're saying, okay, you pretend as if it's a mechanism with money, accept payment and credits. Let's see how well you do. But that's still a really rich design space, because you can ask questions about just normative questions about this, like, how is this a good idea? Is this efficient? What other objective is it trying to target? But also like more engineering questions, like what one-shot mechanism should you use each day? Does it matter whether you do first price or second price in a setting like this? A really fundamental one is, how should these endowments be set? I'll give you some thoughts about this, but I think that's far from answered, far from well understood. Like, it's really an open question about what to do. Getting back to Aaron's question, what do you do with users when they get bankrupt? Like, what's the right way to deal with them? I'll give you a partial engineering answer, but far from being a happy answer in a certain way. And then also just the kind of usual questions we ask about like complex versus simple mechanisms in this setting. Like, well, what's the limits versus what can you do with simple mechanisms? So here's a very high level summary of what we did manage to source. So what we've shown is that for these general settings, if you do an artificial currency mechanism, and if you do it over a large enough period of time, so if you do it for 1 day, then there's no use, because if I give you some number of credits, you're going to bid all of it. There's no value to these credits. But somehow you hope that if I give it enough time, then these take value, and that turns out to be true. So in particular, these mechanisms can emulate any Bayesian mechanism. So you choose a Bayesian mechanism with money, you can sort of exactly emulate any allocation of that up to sort of vanishing loss in efficiency or vanishing loss in like the quality of the allocation. But it's never going to be perfectly truthful. Again, just because imagine the last day, you're going to bid everything you have. But the gains that you get from non-truthful reporting also vanish over time. So you can simultaneously be near efficient and near truthful, and both these approximations vanish as time increases. So that's sort of the Bayesian version of it. What's a little more interesting is you may say, okay, where are you getting these priors from? How do we know people's values? Why are we assuming we have these distributions? And what if we just give out these budgets and then just sit back and wait for an equilibrium and see what happens? And surprisingly, you can say some things about it, not for any mechanism, but if you use the first price auction each day, then it turns out that as long as all the bidders are symmetric, then in equilibrium, this is half efficient. Half minus a small o of 1, which is it's sort of disappearing in t. But moreover, every bidder is guaranteed to get at least half of what is called their ideal utility, and I'll define this in a bit, under very minimal assumptions on this setting. So there's a very strong sense in which something as simple as just giving everyone artificial credits and running a first price auction is both in equilibrium has very strong robustness guarantees.
When you say efficient here, do you mean Nash social welfare or regular social welfare?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in this case, it's going to be regular social welfare if I have symmetric bidders, but I'd give you a slightly general version of this, which is it's going to be close to a Pareto efficient fund, to like a Pareto efficient point, where exactly which point you choose depends on the allocations you give out. So if I give you twice the budget that I give Costas, then I'm somehow shooting for a Pareto efficient outcome where you get twice the utility that Costas gets. And you are close to that point. So your choice of budget is determining which Pareto efficient point you're getting close to. In the symmetric case with symmetric bidders, equal budgets, that is welfare. So here's my kind of, the way I think about it is like artificial currency mechanisms are almost as good as money if I know a lot about people, but at least half as good if I don't know anything. That's what I try to convince you. So, okay, be a little more formal about this. So one naive thing I could do in the setting is, well, I could give everyone these budgets and just to start thinking about it, what if I just run a second price auction each day? And if you think a little about it, you start realizing that this is actually not a great idea because, for example, if I know that you always have a value of 2 and on any day I have a value of 0, I'm going to bid 1.99999 because I want you to try and, if I am trying to be strategic, I want you to try and spend your money as much as possible. So now at a high level, the spending is highly coupled in the setting. So the second price is awesome because usually it decouples bidders, but that's no longer true in this sort of setting where you don't have quasi-linearity. So in particular, I have incentives to deplete people's budget. But it turns out that in Bayesian settings, as long as you give enough time, you kind of get back an approximate notion of this decoupling. So formally, what we were looking at is, okay, so we have a Bayesian setting, so we know everyone has the values drawn from some distribution, independent across bidders and independent across time. And I want to find what I'm thinking of as an alpha beta approximate mechanism, which is one where firstly, any bidder, they're thinking about whether they report truthfully or deviate. And we convince them that if you deviate from truthful reporting, you gain at most some alpha t. And I'd like alpha to be like very small. So in particular, I'd like this to be sublinear. So deviation gets you a sublinear gain per, like a vanishing gain per day. But moreover, the loss in efficiency, as long as everyone is reporting the truth, is also sort of vanishingly small.
T here is like the number of rounds or something?
E is the number of rounds, yeah. And the guarantee we basically get is as long as we know what the distributions are, you can tune the budgets carefully. And also you need to do certain small like modifications. In particular, when agents get bankrupt, you should sort of keep simulating them. You can't have them just disappear from the market. But as long as you do that, you can simultaneously make both alpha and beta sort of disappear over time. So the per round gains from deviation and the per round loss in welfare are both simultaneously going to zero as T goes large.
And then presumably this truthfulness guarantee is sort of like at round one. If I consider like a life of devious life, then over the sequence I will gain at most that much. But it seems like a lot of the action is going to be at the end. Like, does it all fall apart in the last few rounds? Like nobody has any incentive guarantees at all anymore?
Yeah, pretty much. Like the easiest version of this is in the last round, you have no incentive guarantees. But so there's actually a slightly weaker result than maybe the way I'm stating it. So it is also assuming everyone else is truthful. So assuming everyone else is reporting truthfully, I'm trying to convince you, like think of it as a reason to do automated bidding in some sense. So should I write a program to tell the truth, or should I try to run a reinforcement learning algorithm? No, there's no point.
Okay, so like if at round one, my choice is, you know, I can like commit to truthful reporting or do something more complicated, I have little reason not to commit. But like, if I'm making the decisions myself, then like in the last week, we should expect like all hell to break loose.
Exactly. At least this result doesn't say anything about that. So this is, it's nice in that things are vanishing and going to zero, which we like, but there are a bunch of assumptions. Yeah, Kostas, go ahead.
You know, regarding this point that Aaron has been making about, you know, getting close to the horizon and hell breaking loose, I was wondering, like, in terms of the modeling of the problem at hand, is the finite horizon the right model, or should we think about it, you know, like sort of like some kind of like stationary mechanism design formulation where kind of like there's some discount for the future and we're stationary?
Ooh, so I agree with that. So I agree some of these weird effects will disappear then. But I would actually argue that's still somewhat artificial. Like, this is a longer discussion, but I somehow feel discounted models hide certain assumptions which are not obvious. Whereas the nice thing with finite horizon is I feel it's a little more transparent exactly what we're losing. And I am going to try and fix this in a few seconds. So yes, you will get stronger results, but I think that becomes less transparent.
Like the Los Angeles example, like, you know, where I'm bidding every day for buying things with my points.
You can carry over your currency. Yeah, so.
You can carry over your currency. How, like, am I getting a salary in points every month?
Effectively.
Like, how does this work?
I think they give it, at least I think they used to give it every year, but do not quote me on this. But yeah, it is more like a salary. So I totally agree with you that an infinite horizon average cost version of this problem is closer to reality, but I am not sure we will get more insights if we do that. So yeah, this is a longer discussion, but like there was a deliberate, it's not so much that like we didn't do finite horizon because it was easier to analyze. We actually did think this gave us more insight into the problem. As an aside, there is a weaker version of this in the infinite horizon. So there's an amazing paper by Matt Jackson and Ugo Schonenstein it's called something like linking mechanisms, which essentially shows that when you have complicated mechanisms and you can link infinite number of them, you can basically achieve the efficient outcome anytime by carefully linking them together. So this is sort of more of a finite horizon version of that result in a certain sense. But I do feel like we gain something from actually going in and looking at the numbers. And I will fix Aaron's concerns in a second, but no, that's a very fair question. Like, yeah, we were tempted to do that, but yeah, this is deliberately done. Getting back to Aaron's question, so I think the two concerns that have been raised, or okay, one I've raised, but is, well, I don't think knowing value distributions makes much sense, but then B, I'm not saying anything about out of equilibrium. So it would be nice if I can somehow handle both of these. What can I do if I don't know distribution? Then what can I say about the actual equilibrium behavior rather than just saying, well, if everyone programmed to tell the truth, then we'd be fine. And here, so this took us much longer to do. I mean, the first result was in 2017. This is basically just being accepted this year. But what we ended up doing was we ended up thinking about a much simpler setting, which is what if we just do the repeated first price? That is what is being used in practice. Like, is there some good equilibrium guarantees for this mechanism? So in particular, what if I give everyone a budget of BI and then each round just run a first price action? And this is, again, I mean, okay, it's clearly much trickier. It's a dynamic game. It has kind of weird incentives. You can have equilibrium, like trigger strategies, collusive behavior, all sorts of weird things. But nevertheless, here was one entry point which gave us some hope, which was as long as the agents were all symmetric, and well, clearly you should give equal endowments in that case. If you believe the agents are symmetric, there's no reason to treat them in a different way. It turns out that any Nash equilibrium, so if you believe in people's ability to find an equilibrium strategy, then any Nash equilibrium is at least half efficient. So it's a little stronger than saying it's a price of anarchy guarantee, but this implies that the price of anarchy of this mechanism is half minus something vanishing in T. As far as we know, so okay, I don't know enough about this, but like this is one of the very few, maybe the only mechanism I know where we have a price of anarchy in a setting with state. So I guess EVA has something similar, or this kind of a thing for like a setting with queues, but there are very few cases where we can say something about the price of anarchy of these dynamic mechanisms, but this is still unsatisfying because I've only said something about equal, like symmetric bidders. So can we say something about asymmetric agents? And this is already tricky, and this gets back to my original point, which is if the agents were asymmetric, then how do I even know what people's values are? If someone says my value is 100 times yours, and I can't ask that person to put their money down where their mouth is, well, what do I do? I can't really compare these people. So in order to deal with this, I'm going to take a little bit of an aside, and I'm going to go back to, we ended up going back to this literature on bargaining in economics, where I need to somehow figure out a way of comparing agents who, even though I don't have money. And what I'm going to do is, instead of thinking about agents' utility, I'm going to ask the following question, which is, suppose I give every agent a budget. I'll think of it as basically giving them a promise that you have a certain fraction of the items which you can take. Like giving you a budget of 1/n of 1 over n means you have a right to 1 over n of all the items. And if I ask you, well, what 1 over n fraction you would want, you would choose your favorite 1 over n. So for example, in hindsight, if you knew all the valuations each day and I ask you to, your budget is half the total budget that I give out, that's kind of saying you have a right to half of the items. So you can pick any half of the days and those items are yours, and whatever value you get from that is yours. That is your ideal utility. Right? So there's a problematic notion immediately because, well, if I insist that everyone gets half the items, they may all sort of coalesce on the same half of the items. It's not clear there is a way to actually realize this. So there may be no allocation which gives everyone the ideal utility, but it's still a benchmark worth thinking about. So again, the benchmark I'm going to think about is I've given everyone some budget, and I will think of that as a right to that fraction of the items, or that fraction of the probability space, the measure over these items. And now I want you to think about what's the value you would get if you chose your favorite fraction, no matter what anyone else did. And the style of guarantee I want to give is, well, firstly, okay, this may not be feasible, but I could still ask what fraction of this ideal utility I can guarantee each person. And by doing this, I no longer need to actually compare people to each other. Each person is only thinking about their own utility, their own favorite alpha I fraction of the world. And I'm sort of giving them a personalized guarantee which says, you're going to get a beta fraction of that. So that's what we called a beta utopia. It's a guarantee that you will get a certain fraction of your ideal utility. And I mean, as an aside, and this gets back to Aaron's earlier question, these ideal utilities in some sense are ways of like picking out points on the Pareto efficient frontier. So if I choose these betas, I'm kind of targeting a certain point where each person gets a certain fraction. And this has really close sort of ties with the bargaining literature. So for anyone who's seen some, like say the Kalais-Morodinsky solution, that's kind of the maximum value that you can get for these ideal utilities, or the maximum achievable point, which is closest to these points. And the theorem that we have is that the artificial currency first price auction for every agent guarantees them at least a half fraction of their ideal utility, no matter what anyone else does. So the beta utopia, sorry, I skipped this, but I was basically asking for this in a max-min sense. So no matter what other people do, I want to guarantee you're going to get a beta fraction of your ideal utility. And the formal result we're proving is that every agent gets at least half of their ideal utility, no matter what the other agents do. And as an aside, if you sort of parse through this definition, this sort of immediately implies the symmetric case as a corollary. So in the symmetric case, if I know everyone is symmetric, then everyone should get a 1/n fraction, and you're getting at least half of that, which means you're getting half of the optimum. Questions about, sorry, I went over this sort of fast. So this is the kind of surprising robustness that these mechanisms seem to have, which is no matter what other agents are doing, they actually have a hidden kind of fairness guarantee that everyone is guaranteed not exactly what they should get, but at least half of what they should get, even if everyone else is being adversarial. I'm going to briefly explain how we can prove something like this. So essentially what we do is, like, once we knew that we're thinking about a max-min value, I can think of all the other agents as basically ganging up to try and mess me up. So I'm trying to get my alpha I share of the items. Everyone else is just like, they don't care about the items. They just want to sort of mess up what I get. But now the nice thing is, so what we really want to do is we want to say, if now this is a two-person game where I'm trying to play a strategy and everyone else is trying to play a strategy to make sure I don't win what I should get. So it's now a zero-sum two-person game. But the nice thing with the first price auction is anytime the world blocks me from getting what I want, they need to pay up. So they have a fixed amount of budget that I've given them. If they block me because they bid higher than me, which means they lose some amount of the budget. So there's this kind of conservation law that it's either I win or you lose in a certain sense. And you can exploit that to actually construct a max-min strategy. So, or at least a strategy for which we can like solve the game exactly. So, and this is something we call the Bernoulli strategy. Roughly speaking, it says, if your value is higher than a certain threshold, then you bid a random number, otherwise you don't bid at all. And the point is, the adversary, so everyone else in the world, when they're trying to block me, they don't know when my value is above a certain point. So they need to bid a certain amount to block me, but whenever they bid, quite often they miss and they keep paying out. So it's almost like one of these pointer chasing things where they're trying to guess where I have at which round I'm going to have a high value, but every time they miss, they lose some fraction of their budget. And so their budget is getting depleted fast enough, and that you can kind of use that to show that that means I'm going to get at least half my utility. And I'm doing this argument for any single agent, but like it doesn't matter which agent I choose, it's sort of symmetric across all these agents. Should I be planning to wrap up in 5 minutes? What's the, okay. So I'm not, so for the other part of what I was going to talk about, I'll just very briefly do one of those fast run through of the slides, but this is a good point to pause to explain what we got. So what we're really showing is that these online markets where you give everyone an equal budget, they actually have very surprising hidden fairness properties, or at least in terms of, if you believe this notion of the ideal utility, and these are extremely robust. It doesn't matter what people are doing. There are good mechanisms which achieve this, and therefore this means in equilibrium, people are doing better than this. Does that explain why everyone's using first price auctions in non-monetary settings? I mean, definitely not. There's a lot more going on, but this is still an interesting kind of data point as to why. Like in practice, what people do in these settings is always use first price auctions. There are, of course, many other reasons, but it's good to know that there's some nice worst case guarantee that we have for this setting. Okay, in the remaining 4 minutes, I'm going to sort of, so this was our attempt to try and think about online allocation from the point of view of the Fisher market view. But then there's a sort of natural alternate question, which is where, what if I'm not worried about people being strategic. I just want to maximize some objective, which I feel is good enough to capture fairness. And so in particular, kind of taking off from our variance result, what if I try to maximize online, like Nash social welfare over time? So this is joint work again with Arthur and also Billy Jin, who's a current student at Cornell, and Vasilis Katselis, who I guess is a sort of a neighbor for many of you. So I feel less bad about speaking about this in 3 minutes. You can please catch Vasilis and ask him for more details. But briefly, what we were doing here was we were saying, let's just go back to the same setting, but now these values are completely arbitrary. And I somehow want to maximize the Nash social welfare. So I want, 22, thank you, sorry, Aaron. So that 22. Yeah, but yeah, so I want to maximize the Nash social welfare of the algorithm with respect to the hindsight Nash social welfare for any valuations. It's not hard to see this is difficult to do. So what I'm showing here just as an example is, so this is time, and these are my agents. And you kind of start seeing the sort of weird symmetries which show up in this problem. So I don't know what these values are. So first day, everyone has the same value. I'm just going to give everyone an equal amount. Next day, one guy doesn't have any value. From now on, everyone else has the same value L. I again have to give them an equal amount, and then this thing keeps going on. So there are a lot of hidden symmetries in this problem, due to which, I mean, if you just work through this example, you can convince yourself you can't get a competitive ratio of better than order n. This is just fundamentally hard to get around here. So that's disappointing. I mean, who wants to talk about a competitive ratio of order n? So is anything possible? And here's the sort of surprising thing which turns out to work. So essentially, the problem that I had here was that I had these agents who had very different value in hindsight. So if I look at, there's one agent who has only a value of 1, the other one is L times larger, the other one is L times larger than that, etc. So they are very, very different in terms of just the total value that they have. Like if they were alone in the world, how much they care about this item. And so we could ask, okay, what if I had an estimate of what their total valuation was? So I know for each agent, I have some prediction as to if they were the only person in the world, how much value would they get? And these are not perfect predictions. So I have there's some overestimate and underestimate, but I have some prediction. And it's still not obvious what to do, but the following idea turns out to work really well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these predictions, and then I'm going to promise everyone they will get a certain constant share. So I'll tell everyone, I guarantee you will have 1 over n of every item that shows up every day. Or 1 over 2n of every item which shows up. And here I'm really using the fact that the items are divisible, but I still have half the item left to play around with. And now I'm going to use my predictions and sort of myopically optimize the Nash social welfare each day, given that I've already promised something to each person. So the predictions sort of tell me how much each agent is going to get over the whole horizon. But myopically, I know exactly what the value is each day, and I can try and maximize this amount. So that's basically what I'm saying over here. I split the item. I myopically give I give 1/2n each day to each person. I promise them that, and then greedily maximize. And it turns out that firstly, if my predictions were perfect, my competitive ratio sort of improves from order n to order log n, and this is tight. But even more surprisingly, even if my predictions are really bad, so my predictions could be off by even a factor of n, but the result is still true. So you still get essentially a log n competitive ratio, despite the fact that your predictions are really crappy. So somehow this one small bit of information, okay, what I think is one small bit of information is helping you coordinate these settings much more efficiently than you could otherwise. Okay, so that's my 4-minute version of this. I'm happy to talk more about this, and please find Vasilis and ask him. But this is something we've been kind of thinking a lot about. But just to kind of summarize, what we've been doing is kind of taking this result of variance and then thinking about how can we generalize this to online allocation and thinking about online allocation. And in some sense, we have some headway in all three directions of thinking about it, but like this is far from the final word on this topic. But it is something which is actually used in practice and kind of increasingly important in various decision-making settings. So I'd be happy to like hear more thoughts or like sort of talk to you all about this. And thank you for having me. Sorry for running a bit late, but yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thanks for the great talk, Sid. Are there any questions? Like quick questions, because you're past our seminar time. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so I guess we can end the seminar now and see you everyone next week.
Thanks for the great talk.
Having me.